The stories. Paramedic who returned a ring to the ranger station. He found the ring beneath a bench outside the ranger station after a thunderstorm cleared and left everything smelling like pennies. The inscription was shallow from wear, yet legible enough to stop him cold before he tossed it in Lost and Found. His name was Daryl Keene, 32, paramedic on the rural night unit that parked near the station between calls. He had clocked out late and planned to drive home for eggs and sleep, nothing heavier than traffic and weather. The ring was small, silver, scuffed, with 4 letters etched inside that did not match any brand he recognized. He wiped it on his shirt, felt ridiculous superstition prickle his neck, then reminded himself that metal was just metal. He walked into the station lobby where the maps curled at the edges and flyers begged hikers to sign trail registers. The clerk on duty that morning was a seasonal hire named Isabel Rusk, 26, wildlife biology graduate and coffee loyalist. She wrote the ring in the inventory ledger, asked his phone number for a courtesy call, and slid it into a tray. Dario left a note by instinct, a paramedic habit, logging time and location and weather in case someone asked later. Out in the parking lot, he replayed last night, which featured a stranded camper with mild hypothermia and a false alarm. He could not shake the ring, which was strange, because he usually forgot objects once they were filed and numbered. On his day off, he cut through town for groceries and noticed a poster at the laundromat that mentioned a missing ring. The page was sun-warped and stapled crooked, with a photocopied hand and the same 4 letters circled in black pen. The contact tear slip was gone, but a name remained that matched an old Ranger call sign he knew from dispatch. He remembered hearing it during training, tucked into an anecdote about a search several winters before he joined the unit. Back at his apartment, he opened a plastic tote where he kept spiral notebooks filled with patient notes and road observations. He used them to steady his head when night shifts stacked up and details blurred into one long siren-haunted ribbon. He flipped through a winter notebook and found an entry about a storm closure at the North Ridge trailhead near mile marker. There was a scribble about a reported vehicle in the lot after midnight, and a reference to archived calls marked cold case. The 4 letters matched the poster and the notebook, and his stomach tightened like he had stepped into empty air unexpectedly. He told himself it was coincidence. Then he looked again at the handwriting and knew he would not sleep without checking. He drove to the station and asked for Isabel, who had just come off trail crew support and smelled faintly like pine cleaner. She retrieved the tray, confirmed the ledger entry, and admitted that the ring already drew a call from a withheld number. The caller reportedly asked whether the inscription was intact, then hung up when she offered the standard lost property procedure. Isabel shrugged and said weird things find the station every year, then asked why he looked like he had swallowed a tack. Daryl explained the poster and his notes, careful with phrasing, avoiding names and exact dates that might tag private people. He asked whether the old Ranger call sign meant anything to her, and she frowned like a person trying to remember a ringtone. She typed on a terminal that still beeped like an old cash register and pulled up a thin incident summary from past seasons. The report mentioned a volunteer ranger named Lyle Witt, mid-40s, seen last signing out to check a flooded culvert. Witness statements suggested he turned off the main road to assist a motorist in a heavy rain that erased tire tracks. Final footage from a highway maintenance camera showed headlights near the ridge turnout, then heavy static as wind battered the lens. The 4 letters in the ring inscription matched his initials and a nickname the volunteer used on old trail day signboards. The summary ended with a note that the vehicle and the volunteer were not recovered despite grid searches and river scans. Daryl felt the room narrow, which happened to him on difficult scenes when he needed to pick the next useful action. He asked whether they ever collected personal property from that area, and Isabel said most recovered items turned up much later. She added that spring melt exposes things that winter hides, and lost metal often travels far in culverts and channels. Daryl asked to sign a witness statement, which felt strange, since his only act had been bending for a glint under a bench. He described the find with plain details, like distance from the threshold and position of the bench slats and water stains. He included the weather and the timestamp from his phone, then he photographed the ledger page with permission for his records. On his way out, he noticed a corkboard with dryer lint textures of flyers, including one about historic flood years and culvert maintenance. A little printed square described a storm nearly 20 years back that undercut the ridge road and formed a temporary sinkhole. The line about road repairs matched a rumor he had heard on overnight radio, the sort of thing callers debate between traffic updates. He took a photo of the square and wrote down the maintenance contact number, then drove home feeling like the ground rode along. That evening, he called the maintenance office and reached a supervisor named Raleigh Dim, 51, veteran of patchwork and paperwork. Raleigh remembered the volunteer by call sign and said the guy reportedly once welded a broken gate hinge on his lunch hour. He explained that the ridge turnout drained into a service culvert that emptied into an old arroyo behind a shuttered campground. He added that a private tow company once pulled an abandoned sedan from a side basin during late summer, then misplaced the paperwork. Daryl asked whether the county kept disposal receipts, and Raleigh said archived bills lived in a warehouse that smelled like motor oil. He offered to meet the next morning with access to the paper stacks if Daryl did not mind dust and swearing at faded ink. They met in a low building whose metal roof pinged when gulls landed, and Raleigh rolled out a ladder and a cart with binders. Daryl paged through invoices and found a line item for a recovered vehicle from the ridge vicinity after a storm year. The receipt lacked a plate number, which set his teeth on edge, but it listed a description that matched the volunteer's truck. A handwritten note in the margin directed the tow company to hold personal effects for a claim that never arrived or cleared. Daryl used his phone to scan the page, then asked Raleigh whether the side basin ever got dredged for heavy debris after storms. Raleigh nodded and said they tried, but the basin had pockets where things settled deep and stayed quiet until a new season. Back at the station, Isabel took the scanned receipt and added it to a folder that had begun to resemble a small case file. She called the number from the old poster just in case, and it rang to a voicemail that no longer accepted messages. They agreed not to speculate out loud, which is how responsible people hold a line between curiosity and harm to private families. Instead, they requested access to dispatch logs from that storm week, using internal email channels and precise language about inventory continuity. The logs showed multiple calls reporting a stalled vehicle and disappearing taillights near the ridge turnout around the same time. One archived call captured a voice asking if the station had a spare chain, then cutting out as thunder rolled over everything. Daryl listened and felt a human scale of time, the way a minute expands when weather takes over and simple plans collapse. He thought about why the ring would end up under the bench unless someone placed it, then pictured stormwater spreading like a net. Isabel checked the station exterior and found a grill over a drain that emptied near the bench after long downhill runs. She traced the channel on the maintenance map and saw a path from the arroyo through a culvert that cut beneath the parking lot. It sounded improbable at first, then they considered how small objects ride water differently than larger debris during heavy flow. A ring could slip past grates like a coin tossed to luck, then settle where turbulence died and janitors swept after hours. They walked the route during daylight and marked scuff lines from past flows, following pebbles like breadcrumbs to the station edge. At a low grate, they found a snag of twigs and a strip of cloth that might be from a work shirt pocket. Isabel bagged the cloth and labeled it for possible testing, though neither expected much, and both respected quiet possibilities. They logged locations and took photos from eye level and boot level, then stored everything in the folder that felt heavier daily. That night, a withheld number called the station again and left a message that asked whether the initials were still visible. The voice sounded older and careful, and the caller reportedly asked about stainless versus silver, then thanked someone who had not answered. Daryl suspected a relative who wanted privacy, so he did not push for a callback through caller lookup that might bruise boundaries. Instead, he asked Isabel to post a simple notice that an item was found, with identification proof required and no description. 3 days later, a woman arrived with wind-bitten cheeks and an envelope of photocopies of Trail Day signboards and old photos. She introduced herself as Marnie Witt, 50, postal clerk, and said she believed the ring belonged to someone she once knew. She produced a photocopy of a volunteer roster with initial marks that matched the inscription style and the spacing between letters. She also brought a scanned image of a birthday photo reportedly taken at the station picnic where the ring first appeared on a hand. Isabel followed procedure, asked neutral questions, and requested a description without revealing any difference between steel and silver. Marnie said it was silver and scuffed from manual work, and the letters were done with a cheap engraving pen from a hardware counter. She had no interest in press or drama, only closure regarding a box of things that never found a rightful shelf at home. She did not ask about remains or rumors, and the room felt like a church hallway, with voices quietly minding the floor echo. Daryl watched her study the ring like a person watching weather, accepting change without bargaining. Then she nodded and held it close. She signed the claim form and thanked them for record keeping, then said she planned to take the ring to a quiet spot and breathe. After she left, Daryl and Isabel sat silently with a folder that could be closed even without answers that win headlines. They updated the file with non-identifying language, noting that the event remained unresolved, but an item found its probable keeper. A week later, Raleigh called to say the warehouse yielded another stack of toe slips that linked the earlier receipt to a dated work order. The order referenced a truck pulled from a side basin near the arroyo, with no occupant listed and disposal recorded after waiting periods. Daryl printed the work order and attached it to the file, then suggested a courtesy memo to the county records office for alignment. The memo included excerpts from dispatch logs, witness statements, and the inventory ledger, written plainly, without speculation or sharp claims. He drove to the turnout that evening and parked where the wind rolled downhill like a waterless river over dry grass. He stood by the newly repaired grate and imagined a ring skipping through stormwater, then settling under a bench as the world dried. On the way back, he stopped at the laundromat and saw the old poster had been removed, the staple holes still marking the cork. He felt relief and something else that did not have a tidy name, a feeling like finishing a call without losing anyone. At the station, Isabel had taped a small note above the lost and found that read, "Inventory matters, please describe details patiently." Daryl smiled because he knew how patience saved lives on ugly roads and how tiny facts often carried heavy conclusions silently. He wrote a final entry in his notebook that summarized the chain of events, using timestamps and neutral phrasing like a field report. He listed his own doubts and how they changed, which he did after tough nights, so future him remembered the shape of useful doubt. He drove home and fried eggs and left the radio off, letting the quiet fill in around the edges of the long day. In the morning, he returned to duty and checked his ambulance kit twice, then a third time, because routine confidence keeps hands steady. News never broke big from the ridge, and that felt right, because families deserve weathered truths without strangers guessing for sport. The station kept the folder in a locked cabinet with a slip that directed any future inquiry to records with gentle formality. When Daryl parked near the bench again, he looked at the drain and thanked the design that nudged a small thing into daylight. He also thanked the habit of writing things down, because memory can bend when nights are long and calls stack like restless waves. He knew the ring did not fix the story, yet it tightened the edges enough to hold, like stitching on a torn sleeve. He decided that returning it mattered regardless of headlines, because care can look like a metal circle resting in a palm. Later, a storm rolled across the hills and the station roof hammered, but the grate held and the lot drained without drama. Daryl watched the water pass the bench and felt steadier than the week before, which is a kind of quiet rescue in itself. He thought about that last highway camera clip that cut out as wind rose, and he hoped the driver knew someone kept looking. He believed that simple custody of small objects carried weight, and he promised himself to keep taking notes when the world blurred. The next week, a handwritten thank you arrived with no return address, just a single sentence about holding grief like a stone. Isabel logged the letter, then placed it in the file where it settled beside receipts and call logs and dry photographs. They closed the cabinet gently, like leaving a campsite clean, and the station returned to business with maps and radios humming. Daryl stepped outside, breathed air that smelled like wet bark, and felt awake enough to meet the next ordinary emergency. He walked past the bench and saw nothing shine, and that unremarkable view felt right, like a road that finally held its line. The stories. This motel room voicemail rerouted search teams that winter. They kept saying it started with a motel room that smelled like old coffee and bleach, and with a voicemail nobody expected. The recordings came out in late winter after a storm knocked power across the county and kicked the motel phones awake again. Rhea Tavener was 37 and worked as an emergency coordinator for a spread-out mountain county that never felt ready. She had a habit of keeping paper maps rolled in a rubber band and a small camera tucked under her parka. That morning, she wanted only to rebalance commitments and check that the warming shelter had enough cots for the week. She planned to drive the Ridge Road, swing by the radio repeater, and be back before lunch. The incident started when the Nightlark Motel on the highway called the non-emergency line with a strange message they could not clear. The manager, a tired man named Cal Rudd, told the dispatcher that a red light on room 26 blinked, and the phone kept chiming. He said the display showed a new voicemail that would not delete, and he wanted someone to listen because the guest had left. Rhea took the secondary call because the sheriff's deputies were stacked with fender benders on the main grade. She arrived to find the lobby heater making a low metallic whine, and Cal behind a counter with a cracked bell. He slid the room key and nodded toward the outside corridor, his voice flat from too many nights at the same desk. Rhea used nitrile gloves from her field kit, then lifted the handset and dialed the code that the placard said would access messages. The voicemail opened with a tone and a computerized voice reading the timestamp in a clipped monotone. The date announced sounded like last night near 10, according to her quick notes scratched with a blunt pencil. The message that followed had the kind of audio that police technicians describe as close but muddy, and it made her shoulders rise. A woman whispered that a man was hurt, and she asked for help. Then she mentioned mile marker numbers and a guardrail that bent inward toward a runoff ditch. There was wind noise and the distant thrum of trucks, and what Rhea believed might be the quick chirp of a turn signal. The caller finished with words that sounded like two names, then a tired exhale, then silence long enough to raise goosebumps on her arms. By the time she walked back to the lobby, the dispatcher had already compared mile markers that matched those numbers on the East Highway spur. A search team was gathering at the fairgrounds with 2 four-wheelers and a county plow driver who knew every ditch by seat memory. Rhea signed the log and relayed what she heard, and her own words hardened into directions that sent good people toward a cold bend. An hour later, a second caller reached the tip line and said they had heard the same voicemail when calling the motel to complain about their refund. That person repeated the marker numbers and added that a dog barked once in the background, which persuaded the consensus further. Witness statements began clustering around the East Spur, and a deputy noted in the dispatch log that he had seen a bent guardrail near marker 32 2 days prior. The search teams rolled that way in a slow line of lights that looked brave against the blank sky. Rhea drove separately and scanned plow berms that faced the wind, because snow settles in patterns that trap fresh tire ruts longer. She told herself that the timestamp was clean, and that the voice felt close, and that people needed her to stay practical. The first mile produced a stranded sedan with a dead battery and a sheepish driver, and the second mile delivered a drift that swallowed half the lane. They found nothing that matched a serious wreck, only plastic shrapnel and a glove lost last week, which made her think about timing again. Back at the fairgrounds, a radio operator replayed the voicemail on a speaker, and the group leaned in. Rhea asked Cal for the motel's phone vendor contact, and he brought out a binder with hand-printed notes in thick marker. She called the vendor and asked about power cycles and about date behavior when the system lost time, and the technician promised to check archival events. She returned to the voicemail and listened for anything that placed a person rather than a highway, because people leave fingerprints in sound if you keep still. The second listen gave her something new that felt small but pointed. Right after the caller said the mile marker numbers, the wind changed tone for half a second, then a faint clack sounded like an elevator door. That did not belong near a rural guardrail, and it made her write elevator with a question mark next to it, which was not her usual habit. She also caught the soft bleep of a room keycard reader, which could have been the motel hallway if the phone had been on speaker, or a different building entirely. She left the fairgrounds and drove back to the Nightlark with the camera on the seat, planning to map every sound in the hallway against her memory. Cal mentioned that room 26 sat above the ice machine and that the elevator had a sticky door that made a little clap. She asked who stayed in that room last night, and his ledger showed a single occupancy, paid in cash, by someone who wrote a name that did not match any local license. He shrugged and said the guest checked out at 6 and that housekeeping already turned the room. Rhea asked to see the housekeeping cart, and the housekeeper, a careful woman named Jillian North, said she had found the room tidy. Jillian said the phone had been off the hook at first, which she corrected, and she said the window faced the back lot where trucks idled. Rhea asked if anyone had used the lobby phone when power returned, and Jillian said a traveler borrowed it while waiting for a ride that morning. That detail felt important because lobby phones sometimes route through the same server as the room phones, which can create strange behavior. The vendor called back and reported that their server recorded an abnormal offset during the storm, which could shift timestamps for local voicemail. He said the system fell back to a factory clock tied to a different zone and then resynced once the internet returned, which can mislabel messages. He promised to send a small report, and Rhea wrote down the gist, then underlined the word offset because she disliked anything that moved signposts during a search. The dispatcher added a note in the log with that information, and the group paused to reassess direction. Rhea listened again and measured the gaps between key clicks and the turn signal chirp, and she kept hearing something like a vending machine compressor. She stepped into the hallway and held her phone down by the ice machine, and her recording later showed the same humming cadence. The voicemail might not have been a live plea from a ditch, but could instead be a message recorded in the building and then captured by the motel system during the storm. She asked Cal whether any old messages archived on the server could return as new after a reset. Cal admitted that he had once lost all messages after a lightning strike and then found them again as new after a technician visit. He said the phone guy joked about ghosts calling back to settle their bills, which did not sound funny to Rhea at that moment. She pressed for dates and asked whether past incidents lined up with heavy weather, and he nodded toward a clipboard full of repair tickets. The dates matched cold weeks when snow slid from the roof, and the idea of an old message waking up felt more likely with each line. The next step was to figure out who had left the recording, and whether the details pointed to the East Spur or somewhere entirely different. Rhea asked for prior registration cards for room 26, and Cal produced a stack bound with a rubber band that snapped on the counter. She gently sorted through and found a multi-night stay from late last winter under a name that also did not match a license. The rate was discounted for cash, and the note column said, "Truck Lot View," which fit the sound of idling engines in the message. She then called the State Patrol office and asked for any incidents last winter that involved a bent guardrail near any similar marker numbers. The trooper on duty searched reports and told her there had been a slide-off on the West Highway spur near marker 32 during a storm in late February. He said the driver had fled before dawn, and a passing snowplow called it in, and the car was recovered later without injuries, according to the archived calls. That wreck would have put a person back in town by breakfast, and possibly in a motel room across from trucks. Rhea returned to the audio and timed the interval between the words and the faint elevator clap, and then timed the lobby elevator with her own phone recording. The match was not perfect, but close enough that a court would likely call it consistent under ordinary conditions, according to her training notes. She also realized the turn signal chirp probably belonged to a guest being dropped at the front door, not a car on the highway. The dog bark could have been a pet in the lot, which often happens near the vending area after check-in. She asked the radio operator to broadcast a simple clarification and to slow the east spur sweep while a second team checked the west. The deputy, who remembered the bent rail on the east, admitted he might have mixed the side of the county in his earlier note, which happens when shifts run long. The west team found the old repair spot with fresh snow around the posts and an evidence marker for a past accident half buried under ice. It seemed the voicemail referenced a prior event that had already closed, and their winter storm had wrapped it in new confusion. Rhea then visited the neighboring diner, where the night shift sometimes noticed details people forgot to hide, and she asked about the guest who paid in cash. The server, a college student named Del Finch, said a man sat alone near the window around 9, then stepped outside to take a call. Del remembered because the man cupped his hand over the motel phone receiver in the lobby, which struck Del as old-fashioned, and then asked for a ride to the bus station. That would place the phone call inside the building. During the same hour, the voicemail claimed she requested the motel camera footage for the hallway by room 26, and Cal said the system stored 2 weeks, which happened to straddle their storm. The timestamp on the clip showed a flicker at 9:58, right before the server saw the man on the lobby phone, which made her careful notes lean toward a local recording. A county technician extracted the audio from the clip, and while it was muddy, a mechanical ding from the elevator landed exactly where her earlier timing suggested. The odds of a live highway recording sharing those indoor sounds felt very small. The twist arrived quietly when the vendor finally sent logs that showed the voicemail database replayed queued items after resyncing and labeled some as new. One item matched a stored call from late winter last year that had been partially corrupted, then reconstructed during the reboot. The metadata showed Room 26 as the destination for that older call, which explained the light and the stubborn message and made the puzzle sad rather than sinister. The message people heard belonged to a different night and a different problem that resolved without tragedy, and it had been pulled forward by a storm. Ria wrote a summary for the incident file that emphasized the difference between live audio and replayed audio, then highlighted the risks during outages. She recommended an added step where dispatch confirms time against independent sources when a tip arrives through a system that just recovered. She also asked the motel to change their default message code and to put a note by the desk to call her office if room phones behave oddly after storms. Cal agreed and added a bright sticker to the binder with her number, which made her smile despite the long day. The search teams returned after noon with tired faces and a neat inventory, and they ate chili from a crock that steamed the fairgrounds office. Ria thanked each person by name and reminded them that a wrong turn during a fast morning did not mean a bad job. She said the lesson was about signals and systems and about winter technology that lies twice, and everyone nodded while they warmed their hands. She filled out the reimbursement forms for fuel and gloves and slid the packet into the outgoing tray with a note for finance. In the evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the paper map unfurled and marked the motel with a small circle. She added a line toward the west spur and penciled in the marker numbers with a question mark to reflect how close memory can sit to fact. She listened to the voicemail one last time through headphones, and this time the vending machine compressor sounded obvious enough that she wondered how she missed it earlier. Fatigue makes patterns where there are none, and urgency can turn a whisper into a highway without much effort. A week later, the vendor installed a firmware update that locked time against a battery backup so power glitches could not shift anything. The sheriff added a line to the dispatch checklist about confirming independent clocks, and the radio operator taped a bold reminder above the console. Jillian named the ice machine Manny as a joke in the break room because it hummed in the same rhythm as the recording. Dell laughed and said the elevator still clapped, but only when someone shoved a luggage cart too hard against the door. In a different winter years ago, the same storm pattern had toppled a repeater and blacked out an entire valley, which lived in Ria's head. She thought about that while walking past a wall of snow tools at the supply shed, and she decided to put spare batteries for hotel systems on the grant list. It felt like a small change inside a big map, and that was how she survived seasons that piled risk on top of routine tasks. She pinned the grant idea to her bulletin board and wrote a short sentence that read, "Verify time before direction." No one ever found the man who left the cash registration during the recent night because he boarded the bus and vanished into ordinary life. The earlier driver from last winter had been located and fined, according to the archived paperwork, which made that thread tidy in the official sense. The county slid back into the rhythm of plows and calls and an occasional lost tourist, and the motel phone stayed quiet except for room wake-ups. The red light over room 26 stopped blinking, and the ice machine chugged along with stubborn loyalty. Rhea kept the pencil notes in a folder labeled with the motel name and the date and included a copy of the vendor logs. She handed a training copy to the new deputy class and asked them to listen once without context, then again with the building map. The exercise worked because people learned how easily a detail snaps a hunch in half, and how worth it is to test every hunch. They left with a habit of checking other clocks before sending trucks into the cold, which is the sort of habit that quietly saves lives. By late spring, the guardrail on the west spur reflected the sun with a fresh coat of paint, and the plow berms had slipped away. The fairgrounds chili pot was replaced with a cooler of sports drinks, and the radio chatter turned toward camping permits and picnic warnings. Nobody brought up the voicemail during the season kickoff meeting, but everyone remembered the morning they chased a ghost along the east spur. The minutes simply read "Time Verification Protocol Updated," which looked small on paper and felt big in practice. People who were not there will say it was obvious from the start, and they will wonder why teams moved before verifying. People who were there remember the tone in that whisper, and the way good intentions sprint when wind hits the valley wrong? Rhea thinks the truth sits between those angles, and that winter rewards humility more than certainty, especially when phones and storms share a stage. She wrote that in the margin of her map, in handwriting that tilted uphill like a person leaning into a cold night. When she passed the Nightlark one afternoon with the window cracked, she heard the elevator clap echo through the empty corridor. It sounded like a period at the end of a long sentence that finally made sense, and she let the thought linger until the highway bent. The motel squatted back into its season of travelers who just need a warm bed and a snow-free path to the door. The voicemail lived on in a folder, and in the way the county listened to machines, and in the simple habit of checking the time. The man who knocked on every door in Pine Hollow. Neighbors in Pine Hollow reported a quiet man who moved methodically along Oak Ridge Drive after sunset and knocked once. Deputies logged several calls that week, yet no report identified the man by name or vehicle. The pattern ended abruptly on a rainy Thursday, and the gaps in the record began to matter. The first documented account came from Wasco County dispatch logs, which noted a single knuckle rap at 1912, followed by silence. A resident stated the man stood at the threshold, hands visible, head tilted slightly, and then stepped away. The resident described a canvas jacket without insignia, worn boots, and a square envelope held flat against his chest. Deputies were sent to canvass the street, and the man was reportedly gone before units arrived. The primary witness, Daniel Kerr, age 47, gravel truck driver, said he noticed the man returning 2 nights later near the closed marina. Daniel waited in his idling pickup, watched the man approach a darkened porch, and knock once without speaking. He saw no exchange through the glass, only a porch light flicking on and off, then the man moving to the next house. Daniel's statement was placed in the county file from 2009, and the handwriting appears tense and compact. A second account came from Leah Morton, age 59, substitute teacher, who walked her dog along the cul-de-sac after dinner. Leah reported the man carried no phone, wore no hat, and kept his eyes level with the door viewer. She noticed how he checked the upper corners of the frame as if counting staples, then folded the envelope tighter under his arm. Investigators never confirmed the envelope's contents, and records conflict on its color. State records show a property tax dispute on Oak Ridge Drive that same month, naming 3 parcels with unpaid assessments and an appeal pending. The appeal file lists a former survey technician, last known address outside the Dalles, who had worked boundary lines across irrigation easements. Some locals claimed the technician had returned to challenge a fence line, although there is no letter on file supporting that claim. The assessor's office released redacted notes, and the names do not match the dispatch entries. Archived notes from the Pine Hollow Volunteer Fire Station mention porch cameras that failed to capture clear frames during the week of calls. One entry states that a resident's motion light pulsed once, then stayed dark despite a fresh bulb and verified wiring. Another entry states that a door chime rang without a knock, although the owner admitted the chime sometimes rang during wind gusts. Investigators never confirmed a power issue beyond routine outages common on stormfront days. When deputies finally performed a coordinated evening walkthrough, the man reportedly shifted routes and used the lake road toward the bait shop. A clerk recalled a customer who bought coffee and asked whether mail still reached houses at the top of the ridge. The clerk could not specify the day, and the receipt tape for that window was already binned with cardboard. The detail about mail service was later flagged in the county file, though no follow-up appears in margin notes. A pattern emerged in the statements gathered by a junior investigator whose name is smudged in the photocopy header. Houses that received a knock often had handwritten notes taped inside the peephole, visible only from the hallway when the door closed. Several residents denied placing the notes, stating they never tape instructions near the chain, latch, or viewer. The notes are not preserved in evidence, and their wording is reconstructed from interviews made days later. One homeowner, Victor Ellis, age 63, retired millwright, said his note read, "Leave parcels at side gate," scrawl pressed hard into the paper. He told deputies he never writes delivery instructions since he meets drivers at the carport. Victor's niece, who visited that evening, said the paper looked old and brittle, with faint grid lines under the pencil marks. Investigators never confirmed the source of the paper, and lab submission forms were never filed. A door manufacturer from the Dalles reviewed the reports and suggested a different angle after reading the archived notes. He said a single controlled knock can test the door's hang, its weather strip seal, and the position of the latch tongue. The detail interested the assessor's office, which had previously measured door sets for code compliance during a flood mitigation grant. Investigators never confirmed that the man performed any inspection work, and no invoice appears in state records. On the fourth night, rain tracked along the lake road and gathered in shallow ruts below the cottonwoods near the culvert. Tire marks branched toward the closed campground, though the gate chain hung straight and unbroken when the deputy checked. A bait bucket sat on the picnic table, lid clamped tight, no name written on the plastic rim. The deputy's body cam records a distant knock across the water, yet the timestamp shows a gap during the crucial minute. Leah said she later found a folded map inside her storm door, not sealed, edges damp, street grid drawn in felt tip lines. The map circles 3 houses on her block, including her own, and one small mark near the mailbox cluster. She turned the map over to the volunteer station, where it stayed on a corkboard under thumbtacks until the cleaning day. There is no scan of the map in the county file from 2009, and its chain of custody is uncertain. Some locals claimed the man used an old meter reader route and followed hydrant spacing to match lot boundaries along the ridge. Others said he was a process server who refused to speak in case a door camera captured the wrong introduction. A process server out of Portland denied any contract in Pine Hollow, although the business address had changed since the inquiry. The utility company provided a general statement about discontinued walking routes, and no roster shows the man's name. 2 weeks after the first call, a holiday light strand appeared across several porches on the upper bend near the empty lot. The strand was wired through existing hooks, as if measured in advance by someone who knew the spacing. Residents assumed a neighbor helped, then realized the plugs sat 2 inches short of every outlet by the same small margin. Investigators never confirmed who strung the lights, and the strand vanished before the next rain moved through. A ranger from Wasco County described seeing footprints that began at the culvert and ended cleanly at the asphalt, no gravel drag. He mentioned a habit common to inspectors who step carefully to avoid leaving debris on a finished surface. The remark was noted by the junior investigator, who annotated the margin with a short underline near the word habit. There is no supplemental report explaining why the underline mattered, and the review ended before winter. The final reported knock came on a Thursday when the lake wind shifted and carried wood smoke down from the ridge. Daniel said the man stood at the last dark porch and waited 20 seconds, then leaned forward as if listening. Daniel saw the envelope held flat again, edges softened by damp and a corner bending toward the man's thumb. When the porch light blinked, the man lowered his head, tapped the doorframe once, and left the envelope on the rail. The envelope recovered from the rail contained a single sheet with printed rows labeled parcel, line, and correction, followed by blanks. The sheet bore no letterhead, only smudged blueprint from an office printer that misfed often during cold mornings. The blanks suggest a form intended for later entries, not a message meant for the household at that address. Investigators never confirmed which parcels were under review, and the assessor's office closed its appeal log without amendment. Several residents reported silence after the Thursday route, and no further knocks reached dispatch for the rest of the month. Leah said the dog still paused at each stoop, nose close to the weather strip, as if catching a faint chemical tang. Daniel said the campground gate started to squeal with a high note even when nobody touched the chain. The notes on file mention these sensory details, and the phrasing avoids conclusions about what caused them. 2 summers later, a real estate flyer listed 3 homes on Oak Ridge Drive with corrected boundary descriptions in small print. The flyer's map aligns with the felt-tip circles Leah described, though the streets were redrawn after minor subdivision updates. A title officer said those corrections can follow old survey notes that never reached the public plat books at the time. Investigators never confirmed whether the man's envelope related to those adjustments, and the county file closes without resolution. By the time the volunteer station cleared its corkboard, the map was gone, and the thumbtacks left two pale sun marks. The bait shop clerk said the coffee buyer never returned, and the receipt boxes cycled into new weeks without any preserved slips. Neighbors still watch the ridge when the wind drops and the lake carries sound across the culvert in a clean line. The man reportedly knocked on every door in Pine Hollow, yet no record shows who he was or why he measured those thresholds. The stories. Never follow hazard markers from that highway turnout. The warning was simple and unglamorous, according to incident notes kept by the county office. The markers near the turnout reportedly changed positions overnight. Calder Ruiz was 42, and he worked as a traffic sign technician who logged odd reports. He drove a white service pickup, carried a clipboard, and kept a cheap digital recorder for quick notes. He had a plain goal that morning, which was to verify a complaint about missing reflectors. He planned to check mile marker signs, take a few photos, and head back before lunch to file a routine update. The highway ran through scrub hills and freight yards, with a turnout used by truckers and roadside vendors. The spot felt unremarkable, except for a slanted ditch and a concrete culvert with a narrow access grate. A vendor named Orla Finn had filed the first report 2 weeks prior, according to archived calls. She sold tamales from a van, and she told the dispatcher that reflective markers appeared one morning where none had been. She said the markers led not along the shoulder, but down toward the culvert. She also added that her friend nearly drove into the ditch after following the line at dawn. Calder treated such claims with patience, and he had learned that small rumors often hid simple maintenance errors. He expected some prank with stolen cones or a set of survey flags placed by a contractor in a hurry. The turnout was quiet when he parked, and the wind pushed grit against his boots in little waves. He saw the usual chevron sign, the battered guardrail, and two cracked plastic markers leaning near a pothole. He walked the shoulder and took photos, counting faded hash marks and a torn strip of reflective tape. He spoke 3 short notes into his recorder. Then he crouched to examine a set of fresh adhesive pads near the grate. He found a footprint pressed into the powdery dirt between the road and the ditch. The heel had a square pattern, and the toe area looked scuffed sideways as if someone shifted quickly while lifting weight. He looked back toward the vendor spot and saw Orla's van roll in behind him with a sputter. She waved from the window, and he waved back. Then she parked and stepped out with a thermos and a paper cup. "You picked a windy day?" she said with a quick smile. "Something new happened last night. It moved again." Calder kept his tone casual, because people shared more when no one made a big show of expertise. He asked what she meant, and she pointed to a row of small reflective buttons arranged along the gravel like breadcrumbs. He followed the dot pattern with his eyes and saw how it led down the gentle slope. The dots curved right, skirted the drain opening, and ended near the culvert mouth where the grate sat partly ajar. He took more photos and a measurement. Then he pulled a glove and tested the grate with a light tug. It shifted with the gritty squeal of old metal, and a faint smell of machine oil rose from the dark. Orla poured coffee and set it on his tailgate. Then she said she had a witness. A night guard from the freight yard told her he had seen a pickup here after midnight, and the guard thought it belonged to utilities. Calder asked if the guard gave a plate or description, and she nodded slowly while searching her phone. She had texted herself a note, which named a green pickup with a white magnetic sticker on the door. He logged that detail and thanked her. Then he walked the turnout again to find any scrap of packaging. Behind a clump of saltbush, he found a cardboard sleeve from reflective pavement dots with a partial supplier address. He called the number listed on the sleeve, and a receptionist confirmed the dots shipped last month to a paving subcontractor. The name matched a company that often handled minor patching, which made the dots less mysterious. He left a message for the subcontractor, then he returned to the grate and peered into the culvert. Air moved with a faint metallic whine, not from wind alone, and he heard a rhythmic clack like a tired fan. Near the grate hinge, he spotted a new bolt that did not match the others. It had a bright finish, and it sat barely finger-tight, which suggested someone opened the grate often since the last inspection. He checked his records on the tablet and found the culvert marked clean in early summer. He had signed that report himself, and there had been no mention of special hardware which sharpened his attention now. A highway trooper pulled in as the wind picked up, and the patrol unit idled beside the vendor van. The trooper introduced himself as Officer Laird, and he said dispatch had pinged him after Orla's call. Calder appreciated troopers at scenes like this because traffic safety turned on small collaborations. He walked the trooper through the dots, the loose bolt, and the unknown pickup. Then he asked for a quick shoulder closure. With the shoulder blocked by the cruiser, he lifted the grate with a strap and set it aside slowly. The culvert was a rectangular tunnel of poured concrete, and the floor held shallow water moving with a steady push. The fan noise grew louder, and he traced it to a box set against the interior wall beyond the opening. It looked like a toolbox at first glance, but a closer look showed a compact pump with a battery and a timer. He crouched and read the timer label. Then he photographed the device and the wiring with the flash. The timer was set to activate before dawn, synchronized with the hour when visibility was worst for sleepy drivers. He followed the hose from the pump and found it terminated at a spray nozzle near the road edge. The nozzle aimed up toward the gravel where the dots were placed, and the residue felt slick on his fingertip. He checked the jug attached to the pump and read a chemical name he recognized from training. The substance was a water repellent that reduced surface friction, used properly on tools but dangerous on pavement. He took a steady breath and reviewed the scene in his head. Then he explained his working theory to the trooper. The device primed the slope, the dots guided a vehicle, and the grate could be forced to swallow a wheel. They followed the nozzle line up to a small clamp on the guardrail where a cable tie held it steady. The tie was new and left trimmed too cleanly, which suggested a practiced hand rather than a careless prankster. Officer Laird called the county investigator, and the call log later showed the time in clean figures. While they waited, a long-haul driver pulled over and asked if the turnout was open, then decided to keep moving. Calder returned to the footprint and photographed a few more impressions, each with the same square heel. He then found something half buried near the chevron post, which turned out to be a white magnetic door sign. The sign had faded letters that once spelled a bland utility name, but the adhesive edge smelled fresh. He wrapped it in a trash bag and placed it gently in a plastic bin from his truck. The county investigator arrived with a camera and a calm voice, and she listened without interrupting as Calder summarized. She then asked Orla about the near crash, and Orla mentioned a delivery van that swerved at dawn. Orla said the driver never reported officially, but he left a voicemail on her phone with a quick apology. He had followed the reflectors into the slope, then jerked the wheel when the front tire slipped on the wet gravel. The investigator asked to hear the message, and she recorded the playback with her own device. She then called the freight yard and reached the night guard, who confirmed a green pickup arriving late and leaving quickly. Calder's message to the subcontractor finally got a return call, and the project manager sounded confused but cooperative. He said no crew had worked near the turnout that month, and he warned that their old magnetic signs were missing. The manager emailed a list of inventory that included reflective dots and a compact pump stolen from their yard. He also mentioned a former employee who had left angry messages after being let go for safety violations. The investigator requested the former employee's name for her notes, and the manager provided it along with a last known number. He then forwarded a statement from a foreman who claimed the ex-worker knew that turnout well. Calder reviewed his photos and realized the dot's position near the culvert matched a layout used in temporary lane closures. The spacing looked intentional, and the curve guided a driver toward the grate with deceptive precision. The investigator noticed another detail while kneeling near the new bolt that Calder had flagged earlier. She pointed out metallic dust on the ground and a tiny notch on the bolt head, which suggested frequent wrenching. They widened the search radius and found a stash buried under a stack of broken asphalt chunks. The stash included more reflectors, a small roll of white tape, and a bag of hose fittings in a sealed pouch. Officer Laird radioed for a property tech, and the investigator began a chain of custody log with brisk handwriting. She photographed each item where it lay, then bagged them and labeled the bags with location notes. Calder stepped back and considered the pump timer again, and he did a quick test under the investigator's supervision. He set the timer to 1 minute, and they watched a fine spray coat the gravel near the culvert mouth. The evidence lined up into an unlovely picture which pointed toward deliberate confusion rather than roadside mischief. The dots provided a path, the spray reduced friction, and the grate hinge allowed a channel to swallow a tire. The investigator checked records for recent calls in the area, and she found 3 reported near misses over 2 weeks. Each call described a vehicle that skidded near the turnout after dawn, then regained traction and drove on. A parts receipt tucked beneath the stash added another strand. When the property tech unfolded it slowly, it listed a specialty bolt from a hardware store, and the timestamp lined up with one of the near-miss mornings. They visited the small hardware store after finishing the scene, and the clerk remembered the buyer by a tattoo. The description matched the former employee, and the clerk said the man paid cash and spoke little. Back at the office, Calder compiled his notes into a clean sequence with times, names, and small physical facts. He attached his photos, transcribed his brief recordings, and wrote a neutral summary that linked each item carefully. The county forwarded the package to a regional unit that handled roadway tampering cases with quiet focus. An investigator from that unit later contacted the former employee and documented a series of shifting explanations. According to a summary circulated at the end of the month, the former employee eventually admitted visiting the turnout. He claimed he had tried to stage a demonstration after a contractor dispute and insisted no actual harm was planned. He reportedly said the pump could not spray enough to cause a skidding hazard, which the unit's test disproved. He also denied placing the dots in a guiding pattern, a claim that failed against the measured spacing in photos. The regional unit issued a safety bulletin that recommended a simple phrase for public messaging about turnouts. The phrase advised drivers not to follow hazard markers from unusual positions near unlit exits or drains. Calder returned to the site after the bulletin, and the grate had been replaced with a fixed hinge and locking bar. The guardrail had fresh bolts, and the vendor spot held 2 official signs warning drivers to stay on the paved shoulder. Orla waved him over and handed him a tamale wrapped in foil while the wind finally calmed. She thanked him without ceremony, and he nodded and said the county would keep checking until the simple things stayed simple. He took one last set of photos for the file and listened to the highway hum roll across the ditch. The turnout had the same bones as before, yet it felt steadier now that the false path had been cleared. He thought about how easily people trusted bright markers on dark mornings when coffee had not quite landed. He knew most hazards were loud and obvious, while the quiet ones sometimes wore official colors and waited patiently. On his drive back, he passed a truck that drifted within its lane before settling, then held straight. He pictured the old dots pulling a half-awake driver toward the grate, and he felt a small knot loosen as he drove on. He filed his final report that afternoon with a measured tone that kept opinions out and observations in. He wrote that a set of reflective markers had been used in a misleading arrangement, and the arrangement was removed. He included a note that the pump residue had tested as a commercial water repellent, not a generalized automotive fluid. He added that the timer settings matched the period between first light and morning shift changes at the yard. The county closed the work order 1 week later, and the regional unit kept its file open for a while. The bulletin stayed pinned in the break room, and the phrase looked unremarkable unless you knew the ditch by that turnout. That plain warning lingered in Calder's thoughts during other jobs, and it shifted from words into a quiet habit. He looked twice whenever he saw improvised markers, and he checked drains with a hand on the grate in patient care. He sometimes drove by the vendor spot after long days, and Orla handed him coffee when he stopped. They both watched trucks push through the wind, and they listened for the honest sounds of tires on dry gravel and clean concrete. The story never made headlines because nothing sensational happened after the pump and the dots came up. The value sat in the absence of trouble, which rarely draws a crowd, but often saves one without applause. He knew the record would sit as a small case inside a larger folder, tucked behind more dramatic files. He also knew that simple markers could pull people off course when placed just slightly wrong, which was worth remembering. The highway kept moving as seasons turned, and the turnout kept its ordinary shape with stubborn consistency. The grate did its job, the guardrail held, and the only markers were the ones meant to guide travelers safely home. He set his clipboard on the passenger seat and rested his hands on the wheel before starting the engine. He preferred the humdrum truth that a fixed bolt and a clear shoulder could turn danger back into routine ground. He drove away without ceremony, and the afternoon sunlight threw short shadows across the service road. The sign on the vendor van flickered in the breeze, and the turnout stayed quiet as the wind lost interest for now. The county would return for inspections according to schedule, and a simple rule would ride with the crews. They would never follow hazard markers from that highway turnout, and they would check who had placed them and why. The stories. Paramedic returned a ring to this hospital wing. The ring sat in a small evidence pouch with a folded intake label, and the label named this hospital wing. Security logged the delivery in the overnight book with a careful time, and they filmed the handoff at the ambulance bay. Calder Ruiz was 34, and he worked nights on a private ambulance that covered the mixed urban fringe. He drove a high-mileage rig with a sticky rear latch, and he kept a quiet notebook under the dash. He finished paperwork after sunrise when the cafeteria coffee tasted burnt and the elevators finally ran without packed gurneys. His simple plan for this morning made sense, and it fit the tired mood of the shift. He would drop the ring, sign the property line, and clock out before the traffic built. The ring was a plain yellow band with a shallow engraving, and the engraving read LK and May 14. He did not remember any patient who mentioned jewelry, and their overnight calls were ordinary transfers and one shortness of breath. The band came from under the bench cushion during cleanup, and he spotted it when a pen rolled and tapped. He pocketed the pouch because it felt wrong to leave it, and he headed for the East Wing desk. The East Wing used to hold telemetry and a step-down, and now it served as a rehab overflow when beds ran tight. The desk kept a property log from older times, and the same binder continued through years of tape and patchwork pages. The unit clerk looked at the label and frowned, and she called for the charge nurse by habit. The charge nurse checked the overnight admits and shook her head, and she said nothing matched a ring for this wing. She asked which patient lost it, and he told her none of their patients mentioned a ring at all. She said they could place it in central security, and they would open a claim if anyone asked later. He nodded but felt a tug, and the label still named this wing in plain handwriting. He asked if the desk ever handled stray property like that, and the charge nurse said it occasionally happened. A maintenance tech leaned from a ladder and listened, and he said the East Wing had its own ghosts by reputation. He laughed when the nurse shot a look, and he added that he meant the cardboard kind. He explained that old property envelopes sometimes turned up behind cabinets, and housekeeping would move them along. He said linens and small items traveled strange paths when movers closed floors, and people forgot until someone asked later. Calder thanked him, then he asked permission to check the binder for older notations. The clerk slid it over and pointed to a rule that said deliveries needed 2 staff signatures. The binder held thick pages with names and room numbers, and some entries noted patient transfers to other wings. Calder skimmed recent weeks and then months, and nothing showed the initials LK, or any ring notes. He asked if the wing ever logged items that did not belong to current patients, and the clerk said rarely. She remembered a wedding band that fell through a bed frame on a weekend, and it took months to track. She said a therapist found it during a lift motor replacement, and the family cried when they got the call. The clerk shrugged and said the hospital felt like a moving chest of drawers, and odds and ends migrated forever. Calder walked to security with the pouch, and the guard on duty scanned the label with a handheld. The guard said the pouch style looked older, and the zip strip color was not used anymore. The guard printed the receipt and asked for a description, and Calder gave the engraving as clearly as possible. The guard searched a property database and found no ring tickets for the wing, and his search covered 2 years by default. Calder asked if there were archived losses in older years, and the guard said records before 2014 were scanned PDFs. The guard called upstairs and requested access to a shared drive, and the wait felt like a small eternity. Calder stood under the camera bubble and reviewed his shift notes, and the notes listed 4 dispatch times with addresses redacted here. He wrote a short line about a transfer from a rehab floor with a pleasant dog calendar, and he wrote another about a night custodian who kept a radio. None of the lines mentioned a ring, and none of the patients wore jewelry in obvious ways. He opened his phone gallery and checked the bench photo he took for restocking, and the timestamp matched their return to the bay. The ring did not appear in that picture, and the bench looked clean and dull. He wondered if the ring slid loose after the photo when the rig shuddered, and the thought did not settle his nerves. The guard waved him back and offered a chair, and they opened a folder of ripped black and white scans. One report flagged an incident in the East Wing, and the date read May 14 of 2010. The note said a patient property bag failed during a bed change, and a ring listed as L.K. went missing. The report said staff searched the room, and linen hampers were checked in central processing. A second note added that the family could not be reached, and a voicemail box stayed full for weeks. The case closed without resolution, and the scan ended with a faded stamp that looked handmade. Calder felt the small click that happens when separate lines meet, and the label suddenly seemed heavier than its weight. He asked if the room number was legible, and the guard zoomed until the pixels turned into blocks. The number looked like 212 or 217, and the wing layout had changed since then. The guard said maintenance might have an old map, and a shop supervisor kept binders in a cage downstairs. Calder thanked him, and he asked to make a quick copy of the scan for his crew file. The guard printed the page and stamped a copy line, and he urged Calder to keep things simple with the wing. On the loading dock, a housekeeper pushed a rolling cart, and she mentioned hearing about a ring on the radio. She said her aunt worked here years ago as a transporter, and her aunt remembered a family who asked about LK. The aunt thought LK stood for Lena Kovacs, and that name showed up on a donor plaque somewhere. The housekeeper stressed that it was just a memory, and people mixed up stories after long shifts. Calder thanked her and asked which plaque she meant, and she guessed it could be by the therapy gym. He made a note with a star, and he promised nothing beyond a respectful check. Maintenance loaned him a binder with a taped spine, and the old East Wing diagram showed rooms from 190 to 230. A paper tab marked a wall removal year in 2005, and the spaces had been reconfigured since that renovation. The diagram showed linen chutes and mechanical closets, and one chute lined up behind the current rehab gym. Calder compared the faded room to a modern corner, and the old room 212 would be near the therapy office. He felt the workable line appear, and it had more gears than luck. He thanked the supervisor and returned the binder, and he set off toward the gym. The therapy office had a bulletin board with service pins, and a small photo showed a woman in scrubs named Kovacs. A caption said she ran a staff fundraiser in 2011, and the photo looked like a copy of a copy. Calder asked the receptionist if Miss Kovacs still worked there, and the receptionist said she retired years ago. The receptionist checked a directory and found no current contact, and then she opened a drawer with old alumni notes. She found a folded program from a memorial tea, and the newsletter said, Lena Kovacs lost a husband early. The print used careful language, and it did not mention the ring or the initials. Calder felt a chill that did not belong to superstition, and he asked security if he could call the number on the old scan. The guard said the number probably died years ago, and he recommended the hospital volunteer office for family links. Calder went there and explained the situation, and he kept details minimal and careful. The volunteer coordinator listened and nodded, and then she showed him a book of donor inscriptions. She pointed at a plaque near the rehab gym, and the name said, Kovacs Family Therapy Garden with a small leaf icon. She said the family sometimes visited during late summer, and she could pass a message through a general email. Calder returned to the East Wing desk and asked again to log the ring, and he added the old report number on the form. The charge nurse read his notes and raised an eyebrow, and she asked whether this was a lost patient or a lost object. Calder answered it was certainly an object, and he was trying to avoid making anyone hurt again. She stared at the band through the plastic and then nodded, and she initialed the line for custody. She called linen services and requested a search of older chutes, and she asked maintenance about a recent vibration test nearby. She then told Calder she appreciated the thoroughness, and she would add her number to the receipt. On his lunch break that arrived at almost noon, Calder called his partner from the shift and asked about the bench cushion. His partner said the cushion ripped months ago near the latch, and small things sometimes fell into that hollow void. He said he once lost a pen that rolled out 3 weeks later, and they both laughed about the gremlins. Calder asked if any hospital staff had borrowed their transport stretcher recently, and his partner said rehab used it during a power test yesterday. The partner said the rehab techs pushed the stretcher over a threshold that made the whole thing shudder. Calder pictured the ring jumping free inside the cushion, and the moment drew a simple line through time. He walked to biomedical engineering and asked about the rehab stretcher loan, and the tech on duty pulled an asset report. The report showed a loan to the East Wing therapy office, and the return time matched their arrival last night. The tech said the stretcher had a known rattle in the side rail, and small items could migrate if they slipped. Calder requested permission to inspect the rail, and the tech handed over a hex key with a cautious smile. He removed the end cap and tipped the rail, and a dust mix fell with a soft hiss. Nothing else emerged, and the ring hypothesis remained just that. And yet, it still felt reasonable. Calder tried laundry services next and asked whether a ring could travel from a chute to a truck and back. The supervisor said it happened rarely, and a ring could ride a torn bag to a cart and escape later. The supervisor said older chutes sometimes released surprises when motors kicked, and vibration made lost things walk. She said one time a pager chimed from a folded blanket, and everyone jumped because the model was ancient. She wrote down the ring details and promised to ask her staff, and she asked for the property receipt number. Calder thanked her and climbed the stairs. Because the elevator seemed suddenly crowded, a retired nurse named Myra arrived for a flu shot, and she recognized the old pouch design at the east desk. She said those pouches vanished after 2012, and she used to seal them with a blue strip. She looked at the initials and stopped, and she softly said Lena kept her maiden name for work. She remembered a shift when a patient requested a chaplain, and afterward a ring went missing from the bag. She said they turned the room upside down and found nothing, and she cried telling the family that week. She asked whether the ring was truly here now, and the charge nurse said it was in security as of this morning. Calder asked whether Myra could share a statement, and she agreed to write a short note with dates as best she could. Her handwriting looked steady for a long history, and she described a bed change and a linen swap. She recalled a code earlier that day in a nearby room, and equipment had moved through the hallway quickly. She said carts piled up while everyone managed the chaos, and the chute doors swung as orderlies cleared hampers. She noted that Lena worked that corridor and often stayed late, and she kept paperwork near the therapy office. Myra ended by saying the family did not push a complaint, and the grief felt huge enough already. Calder added the note to the property file, and he asked security to copy the PDF and the asset report. The guards stapled everything carefully and wrote a short chain of custody line, and then he called his supervisor. The supervisor arrived and listened without interruption, and he nodded at each small connective piece. He said it sounded plausible that the ring traveled by linen or by stretcher rail, and the return timing fit. He asked whether anyone had reached the Kovacs family, and the volunteer office answered that a general email was sent. He decided the ring should be placed with the wing director for now, and then returned when the family responded. Calder walked the ring to the wing director with the charge nurse, and the director unlocked a small safe by the desk. The director read the file twice and looked out at the therapy gym, and he seemed to count years without words. He thanked Calder for not turning this into a story beyond the facts, and he said the path felt honest. He said sometimes the building kept tiny traps from old renovations, and objects slid back into daylight when ready. He placed the ring pouch on a velvet pad, and he wrote the time and his name with a careful hand. He said they would hold the ring in the wing, and they would make sure the right people heard. That afternoon, a volunteer returned with a printed email, and the message contained a phone number that still worked. The director asked Calder to stay as a witness, and they called the number on speaker in a quiet office. A woman answered and identified herself as Mira, and she said she was Lena's niece by marriage. She listened to the summary and asked a few precise questions, and her voice shook on the second. She said her aunt still wore a thin band and a chain, and this sounded like her husband's original ring. She said the family visited the garden plaque every May, and they never stopped asking about a lost ring. They met in a neutral conference room with frosted glass, and the director set the pouch on the table. Mira brought a small photo from 2010, and the ring in the picture looked like the one in the pouch. She asked to hold it for a moment, and then she breathed as if she had been underwater too long. She pointed to a tiny scratch on the inner edge, and it matched a bike fall from their early years together. She explained that the initials were his and hers, and the date marked the wedding by a justice in a quiet office. She thanked the room and said she did not want a ceremony and she was just grateful for care. Calder signed the witness line and pushed the pen toward the director, and the moment felt weightless and plain. Mira asked whether anyone would mind if she visited the therapy garden, and the director offered to walk her there. She asked if the ring could remain with the wing for a little while, and she wanted to place flowers first. The director said the wing would be honored, and he promised to contact her if any details surfaced later. Calder stood back and watched the distance between grief and closure collapse, and it looked like a hallway finally cleared. He nodded to the charge nurse and pocketed his notebook, and he promised to replace the bench cushions soon. 2 days later, the linen supervisor called Calder and said a tech found a torn seam in the stretcher cover. The tear ran along a hidden edge that opened under vibration, and small things could hide there without notice. The tech also found a coin lodged deep inside, and its date hit the same era noted in the file. The supervisor said this was not proof of the ring path, and it felt like a friendly witness. Calder took a picture of the seam and added it to the binder, and he logged the maintenance request for replacement. The small chain of custody now included the rail and the cover, and the line grew stronger without pretending certainty. The wing director arranged a short gathering by the therapy garden, and a few staff who remembered Lena came by. They set a small card that said, "Returned to the East Wing," and they left space for a family decision. Mira arrived with her 2 cousins and a bouquet, and she asked if she could speak to the gathered staff. She thanked everyone for treating the story with hands open, and she said the ring could stay displayed for 1 week. After that week, she would take it home, and she would bring it back every May as a quiet practice. People nodded because the balance felt right, and the garden bench caught the late light gently. Calder watched from the edge with his coffee, and he remembered the pen that tapped the bench before he saw the ring. He thought about the way buildings hold on to things, and how people read meaning into dust and echo. He thought about dispatch logs that look cold until someone traces them, and then the script becomes a real day. He considered the lines that join strangers into an honest arc, and he respected each break where evidence speaks. The ring did not prove fate, and it did prove persistence, and it showed that care can be methodical. He left the garden before the applause faded, and he headed for the bay to start another shift. On his next overnight run, he noticed the new bench cushion, and it no longer swallowed dropped pens into hiding. He kept his notebook on the dash and wrote a line about the East Wing, and he kept the words simple. He wrote that a ring once traveled the hospital like a seed on wind, and the wind finally stopped here. He wrote that people made that stop happen by checking maps and calling quietly, and by not rushing a story. He wrote that the wing felt different now, and the difference came from patience more than any grand event. He closed the book and turned on the radio, and the night answered with the ordinary sound of work. Weeks later, the director sent a copy of a small framed note, and it now sat by the garden plaque. The note stated that a staff family recovered a long-missing ring, and it had rested here for a time. It stated that the return involved a paramedic, a clerk, a guard, a supervisor, and a retired nurse. It added that the file included a torn stretcher cover and a scan dated May 14 of 2010. It invited no legend and made no claim beyond the chain of quotes and receipts, and it felt right that way. Calder clipped the note into his shift binder and smiled, and then he got called out for a routine transfer. On the way past the East Wing doors, he slowed and looked in, and the desk lamp made the binder glow. The charge nurse raised a hand without words, and the unit seemed calm in the bright noon. He thought again about how evidence moves on small wheels and how the best stories stay quiet when finished. He considered how many families carry unclosed lines and how sometimes a lost object can stitch one shut. He knew this ring did not solve grief, and it gave shape to a memory that had gone thin with years. He swung the rig into the daylight and felt the road through the wheel, and the city rolled forward like usual. Months later, he learned that Mira returned each May with flowers, and she touched the glass with the ring inside. The volunteer office kept the file updated in a narrow drawer, and the drawer label read East Wing Recoveries. Security replaced the camera bubble over the bay and kept the old unit for parts, and they joked about relics. The maintenance supervisor finally tossed the torn cover after documenting it, and he felt oddly proud of the careful record. The hospital moved through another winter without big headlines, and the garden kept the same soft wind under the windows. Calder kept working nights and never chased mention, and the crew understood without any speech at all. He still told new hires one short version during checkout, and he kept the details clear of romance. He said a ring with initials LK turned up under a bench after a stretcher loan, and the label named this wing. He said the date on the old report matched the engraving, and the linen path explained the long delay. He said good records and patient calls made the circle close, and that promise is why they log everything. He said someone cried without making a scene, and that is how truth usually presents itself at work. Then he pointed to the property pouch drawer and the fresh bench cushion, and he told them to check twice. Calder visited the garden once more after a busy night, and he stood alone before the building woke completely. He watched sun slide across the plaque letters until the leaf icon warmed, and the quiet felt unearned and good. He thought of how small choices build bridges that do not announce themselves, and then one step reveals the span. He remembered a retired nurse who wrote a careful line and a housekeeper who shared a family guess. He remembered a guard who kept files neat and a director who knew not to fill silence. He placed his palm on the cool railing and chose no grand meaning, and he simply wished everyone a gentle day. The ring returned to this hospital wing by documented steps, and the steps were ordinary and human and steady. The story did not need a mystery beyond time and movement, and it showed how rooms keep modest promises. He considered that a bench cushion, a torn cover, and a faded scan can hold a family together again. He thought that is enough for any place built to heal, and he walked back to the bay without speaking. He started the rig and checked the lights, and the reflections blinked across the wet asphalt. He breathed, then he rolled toward the morning traffic, and the work met him with the same quiet weight. The stories. The quiet truth inside that coastal hospital wing. The hospital sat 2 blocks from the water, and the wing that faced the inlet stayed quiet through every busy shift. People joked about the sea air, then lowered their voices near that corridor like sound itself preferred to drift away there. On a mild spring morning, Leora Penn showed up with her coffee and a checklist, planning to finish safety checks before lunch. She was 34, and she worked as the environmental services supervisor, which meant she tracked odors, stains, leaks, and things nobody wanted to notice. She liked simple goals, like swapping cracked casters on linen bins before anyone tripped while rushing a patient. The storm last week flooded a basement stairwell, and today she wanted to log the final moisture readings and close the work order. Everything else could wait until the afternoon. Her plans changed before the first break. A nurse from the cardiac floor stopped her by the supply elevator and asked a question that landed with a small cold weight. "Did you move a bed out of 12 East overnight?" the nurse asked, because that room looked freshly mopped and nobody had the call light plugged in. Leora said no, then walked the nurse back to 12 East. The room held a made bed, smooth as a catalog photo, the kind of smooth that usually meant empty or staged. The call light cord curled like a quiet reminder, and the plug lay against clean tile. The monitor cart blinked in standby, which was normal if a discharge happened, which the board said had not. She pulled her phone and checked the overnight service log. The log showed a water alarm cleared at 3:12, plus a linen delivery at 3:28, and the standard generator test at 3:30. Nothing about a bed move. The floor techs had signed off at 4, which tracked with the rotation. She felt the wing hush in her ears as they stepped into the hall. The hush was not spooky, just oddly firm, like the sound of a theater after the speakers cut. She remembered 2 other texts mentioning the same hush months ago, which she had written down as acoustic weirdness from the renovation. The walls from the pre-1980 edition met the newer drywall at shallow angles, which could bend sound enough to make a whisper vanish. The nurse pointed down the corridor toward rooms 14 through 20, which were half full after the storm transfers. "You ever notice the alarms sound softer here?" she said, "even with doors open?" That question turned a small worry into a task. Leora thanked her, then called Rafi Soto from facilities, who was 41 and worked nights on chillers and pressure monitors. Rafi said he could meet her after he ran a test on the pharmacy air handlers. She told him 12 East first, and to bring his handheld sound meter. While she waited, she checked the housekeeping closet and found a single wet mop hung wrong side up, which bothered her more than it should. The rag bucket held 5 clean tags, which meant 1 tag missing. She counted cart liners, then photographed the tag numbers, then texted her team group, which answered with the usual thumbs and jokes. Raffi walked in with his meter and a grin, then lost the grin when he heard the haul. He held up the meter while a monitor alarm chirped in room 16. The reading was lower than upstairs by real points, not just a little. He tried the code blue test switch on the mock panel, and the hallway speaker tone sounded like a phone in another apartment. They stood there for a quiet minute that stretched. She felt the cool push of air on her ankles, like a vent trying too hard. Raffi crouched and checked the gap under door 18, then looked at a ceiling return. This wing was set for negative pressure during a flu surge, he said, and someone forgot to return the dampers. That could pull sound into the duct runs. They both knew sound should not disappear completely, and hospital speakers had their own lines, but the observation mattered. Leora asked if maintenance logs showed damper positions. Raffi said the old building used manual marks with paint dashes after a storm, and sometimes those faded. He called his lead, who checked archived notes from winter. The notes reportedly listed a temporary negative pressure setting for isolation overflow and a reminder to reset after discharge. The reminder had no follow-up check line, which could be simple human miss and not a cover for anything worse. Still, the room felt staged wrong. Leora walked back to 12 East, then took photos of the made bed from 3 angles, partly habit, partly evidence. She opened the closet and found a folded patient gown without a size sticker, which was nothing by itself. She checked the Sharps container seal, then stepped into the bathroom and looked at the floor drain for silt patterns. The ring looked clean in a way that suggested a recent rinse, not a final deep clean. She called central coverage and asked if a float nurse had swapped rooms overnight. The charge nurse checked dispatch logs for bed control and found a 1-minute call at 3:29 that dropped before anyone spoke, which felt like a butt dial or a cold finger hitting end. The caller ID showed the station handset in this wing. Leora went to the security office and asked for hallway footage. The officer on duty, a patient man named Colm Reyes, 37, pulled the clip from 3:15 to 4. They watched the split screens without commentary. At 3:17, a linen cart rolled in from the elevator without a staff badge visible. The cart moved slowly, with one wheel catching, which matched the caster she meant to swap today. At 3:19, the cart paused outside 12 East, then shifted, then kept moving toward the end of the hall. They watched for the badge reader hits that should flank every elevator entry on that floor. The system registered 1 badge at 3:14 from Raffi earlier, and 1 at 4 from a night nurse, and none for the cart. Colm explained that carts come up with drivers who badge at the service basement, then sometimes ride with a different staffer when floors swap loads. That could account for the missing badge, and also could not. They checked the service elevator camera and caught the same cart doors sliding open at 3:16. The elevator captured a slice of reflective plastic and the edge of a sleeve, no clear face, and the time overlay blinked because of the generator test. The overlay sync had drifted last week, which Colm was already fixing, which meant timestamps needed cross-checks against other clocks. Leora asked for a still from the moment the cart paused at 12 East. Colm printed a page with the grainy frame that showed the cart handle and a sliver of the room placard. She carried the print back to the wing and held it near the door under the light. The sliver matched the height of the placard, which confirmed little, but the angle of the cart showed the handle turned inward, which delivery staff rarely did when rolling past. She took out her moisture reader and checked the wall behind the bed. The numbers showed dry, which fit the recent mopping. She checked the strip beneath the bed casters and saw a thin gray smear that did not look like dust. She swabbed it with a clean wipe and noted a faint powdery drag on the cloth, not slippery like floor finish. She sent the wipe to Central Supply with a note asking for a basic powder test, which was really a habit from her last job at a larger facility. In that job, she once traced a peculiar residue back to construction dust tracked from a blocked stairwell, which explained an odd cough cluster that week. She had learned that small housekeeping notes sometimes solved problems everyone else framed as strange luck. By late morning, she had a sketch of the corridor on her clipboard with marks for return vents and speaker positions. Raffi walked the ceiling path and found a junction where two return lines met above room 15, which could create a pressure sink if one line pulled harder. He said he would check the damper blades for manual marks, then pulled down a tile and sighed at a rusted screw. "This wing is like a ship that forgot how to float," he said, which she appreciated. A nurse from 19, an older man named Keaton Ward, 49, stopped by and mentioned something from Winter. He said he heard a voice on the hall speaker one night that sounded like a whisper on a phone. Just one word that might have been wait. He filed the report with his supervisor and chalked it up to a bleed from the intercom test. He offered to show his written statement, which he kept in a folder because he kept everything. His statement matched the time when isolation overflow ended, which lined up with the damper story. Leora worked through lunch and built a timeline with the clearest markers. The service log showed an alarm at 3:12 and a linen event at 3:28. The call log showed a 1-minute station call at 3:29. The camera showed a cart at 3:19 by the hall feed with a possible overlay drift. The badge system had no hit at the elevator at 3:16, likely because of a basement badge only. None of that explained the made bed and the unplugged call light. She checked the oxygen cylinder rack in the utility room and counted 2 empties in the wrong slots. The exchange sheets said 4 full arrived yesterday afternoon, with 2 used overnight in rooms 17 and 20. That math should yield 2 full and instead showed 1, which could be a miscount or something more routine, like a cylinder staged for respiratory and not logged. She asked respiratory, who checked their sheet and said they had pulled 1 extra for a transfer that ended up canceled, and that the cylinder sat by a stairwell for 10 minutes while a therapist helped a patient. The therapist sent a note with the time, which was 3:25, which touched the period where things felt odd. By mid-afternoon, Central Supply texted back a photo of the wipe, with a small note. The powder fluoresced under a standard light test in a way that fit with foot powder or a powdered latex glove residue, not construction dust. That pointed back toward a human routine, not a leak from upstairs. The note did not accuse a person, and it did not need to. She went back to 12 East and sat in a guest chair and listened. She heard the sea through glass and vents, a soft hush without rhythm. She leaned forward and spoke into the empty room, a simple line that felt like testing a bridge. "If anyone adjusted your alarms to keep the peace, I will put them back where they belong." Raffi returned with a small rag of paint marked with faded red dashes. He had found the damper blades set to a position used during winter isolation, which explained part of the quiet. He reset the blades to neutral, then ran the test tone again. The hallway speaker sounded like a real alarm finally, and 2 nurses popped their heads out with startled faces, which reassured her and annoyed them. They still had to explain the made bed and the unplugged cord. She checked the discharge board again and found no new names, just a morning transfer to imaging. She pulled archived calls and found another brief call at 3:31 from the same station that ended without audio, which now looked like someone purging a stuck line. Column radioed that he found a maintenance note from Winter that instructed staff to purge stale intercom channels after negative pressure resets, which nobody had repeated since. They called the linen contractor and asked about the overnight driver swap pattern. The contractor said his drivers usually wheel carts onto the elevator and ride to the target floor, but during generator tests, they sometimes stop one floor early and let a staffer guide the cart to avoid stopping between floors. He checked his dispatch sheet and found a driver note that said elevator stopped short during test, staff pushed to 12, all good. He could not give a name, only the time block. By late afternoon, the picture sharpened enough to make sense without drama. A generator test overlapped with a linen delivery and a damper setting that muffled alarms. A staffer moved a delivery cart, paused by 12 East, noticed the mop bucket, pushed the cart aside, and quickly mopped a spill. The staffer made the bed to help, then forgot the call light plug during the rush. The unplugged cord did not match best practice, which would be fixed with a reminder, not a report that accused anyone. The part that still bothered her had to do with the oxygen cylinder timing and the extra pause by the stairwell. She asked Colm to pull stairwell footage if available, which he did, and showed a therapist propping the door while holding a cylinder with one arm and shepherding a patient with the other. The patient looked steady, which matched a canceled transport returning to bed. The moment accounted for the missing cylinder, which returned to the rack at 3:43. She closed her notebook and wrote an incident review in plain language. The review recommended returning dampers to neutral after surge events, verifying hallway speaker levels during generator tests, and making a fast rule about plugging call cords before remaking any bed. She added a line about how lavender air freshener should stay out of patient rooms because it could mask odors that indicate a problem. She always added that line, and sometimes it stuck. Before she left the wing, the nurse from earlier walked up with a small, tired smile. "So, not a haunting," she said. "Just a lot of people doing 3 jobs at once." Leora nodded and answered with the calm confidence of someone who had stared at too many messes that looked like mysteries. "It is pretty much always the simple chain," she said, "and sometimes the chain gets quiet enough that nobody notices the missing link." That evening, after the emails went out, she stood by the loading dock and watched the inlet. The tide came in without hurrying, and the gulls wrote slow lines across the air that nobody would ever read. The wing would sound normal tomorrow, which meant patients would hear every beep that mattered, and staff would hear every page that counted. The quiet truth had not been a ghost, or a cover, or a headline. It had been dampers, timing, human judgment, and a hallway that swallowed sound for a while. She locked the dock door and tucked her clipboard into her bag. She would never tell the story with flair, because the unsung fixes never loved applause. She would remember the hush, though, and the way it taught her to trust the boring explanations first, then test them anyway. In a building stacked with lives and wires, truth rarely shouted. It arrived like a tide in a coastal wing, steady and patient, and loud enough once you fixed the vents. The stories. Church basement inventory revealed alleged proof of entry. The basement smelled like wet cardboard after last week's rain, and the fluorescent lights flickered with that jittery, tired kind of buzz. The line that mattered on the clipboard looked boring at first, but it carried a small number that should have been bigger. Her name was Nora LeClaire, age 34, community center custodian and part-time bookkeeper for the small church pantry. She had the Tuesday shift, which mostly meant moving pallets, counting cans, and scrubbing the concrete where the sump spat out rusty water. She wanted to finish early, pick up a thrifted lamp for her apartment, and call her sister about a family thing. The incident began when she saw the dented case of condensed soup sitting on the wrong pallet, with a slip stapled crooked. A volunteer wrote a note saying damaged during last drop, which did not match the neat handwriting she recognized from Sunday. The sump had overflowed during the storm, and the security cameras upstairs reportedly lost power around the same time. She checked the ledger, found last month's count for the soup, and tapped the line with a capped marker before reading twice. The numbers disagreed by 8 units, and the shrinkage column did not carry any explanation or initials. That should have thrown her for a minute, but a volunteer named Lyle had logged minor adjustments before, then forgotten to sign. She walked the aisles between pallets, past the bin of torn paperbacks, and the rack of winter coats that smelled like cedar chips. A faint drag mark curved through the thin crust of silt left by the flood, wide enough for a small hand truck wheel. It started by the loading door, then slipped behind the pantry shelves, where the camera never had a sightline. Nora took photos on a battered phone, making sure the timestamp showed the date, then set the clipboard on a milk crate. She drew a simple diagram in her notebook, noting each pallet corner, then circled an area where floor paint looked scuffed. She counted the soup again, slowly, touching each can and speaking the numbers under her breath. 8 missing, she said, and it landed with more weight than she expected. She did not like accusing anyone, and the pantry had a habit of losing track during rush weeks. Still, the door to the loading ramp had fresh scrapes near the latch, and the volunteer key box upstairs had been sticky since the humidity climbed. The complication widened when she checked the box of hygiene kits and found a weird mix of travel bottles and 3 missing toothbrush packs. Those packs were counted by weight on a cheap scale, and the number on the sticky label did not match the ledger. The printer upstairs had jammed on Sunday, which meant someone finished the label by hand and skipped the second signature. A neighbor named Pete, age 57, retired mechanic, leaned down the stairwell and called everything steady down there. He helped with deliveries since his shop closed, and he kept spare bungee cords in his truck like trophies. She told him about the numbers, and he shrugged while scratching his jaw with a knuckle. Probably rain week jitters, he said. Then he looked at the drag mark and stopped talking for a beat. The mark led under a folding table, then faded near the coats. He pointed at the wall and said, "That outlet tripped last night. I reset it around 6. Nora asked who else came in yesterday, and Pete listed 2 volunteers by first names, then mentioned a teenager who picked up old pew cushions. She noted every name, added question marks where needed, then walked the perimeter slowly with her phone light near the baseboards. A glint showed beneath a stacking chair, so she nudged it aside and found a broken zip tie. The tie was the same size used for coat rack tags, but also the same size used on the loading door latch. She set it on the milk crate, then checked the thermostat in the storage room because the compressor sounded odd. The thermostat was set to a colder number than usual, and someone had switched the fan to constant instead of auto. She checked archived calls on the office phone, each scribbled on a pad by the reception desk, and saw a message about a refrigeration tech. The date on that message matched the storm, and the next line said, "Service postponed due to flooded bridge," which made sense. The fridge down in the basement had been stubborn for weeks, and everyone had opinions about it. The investigation took shape slowly, with tight steps that felt small until they did not. She photographed the drag, the zip tie, and each shelf with missing soup. She called the non-emergency number listed on the bulletin board, then explained she was not reporting a crime, only logging irregularities. The dispatcher told her to keep notes and offered a reference number she wrote at the top of the page. She interviewed a woman named Karina, age 42, school cafeteria worker, who came for a bag of pantry staples before her evening shift. Karina said she saw a man at the ramp door on Monday wearing a baseball cap that hid most of his face. He held a coat on one arm, and he carried a reusable bag with a grocery logo. He left quickly when a choir member came through with sheet music and coffee. Nora thanked her, wrote down the details, then asked Pete if a delivery truck had come without posting in the group chat. He said no trucks except the dairy driver, who dropped crates outside after the storm. He showed his phone, scrolling through photos of the ramp, and pointed to a picture from early morning that showed the door closed with a new scratch near the bottom hinge. She opened the binder of fire inspection reports, looking for any change that registered during the outage. The inspection from 2 months ago said the exit alarm was functioning, and the last weekly test had initials from Lyle again. She went to the exit door alarm, pressed test, and watched the light flash, but heard no chirp. The battery had been pulled slightly, not fully removed, just eased out enough to break contact. She took a picture with the battery number visible, then slid it back in and heard the chirp, which made her flinch. Pete raised his eyebrows and said, "That is not wind," which sounded like a joke until he saw her keep writing. She checked a box of donation forms under the big table, where volunteers slipped notes when drop-offs came after hours. One envelope had muddy smears on the edge, and the handwriting said coats only with an underline that went too far. Inside sat a receipt from a thrift store with a timestamp from late Sunday, and a note that said leave by ramp door because of stairs. Nora called the thrift store, asked a clerk if a man in a cap had bought bulk coats, and waited while the clerk checked. The clerk said yes. A tall man with a limp bought 9 coats and paid cash, then took the bus toward the river stop. Nora wrote that quickly, added the time, and drew a tiny bus icon without thinking. She opened the old laptop in the office and loaded the final footage saved before the outage, which barely showed the stair-top landing. A shadow crossed the landing on Monday evening at dusk, carrying something bulky, then returned minutes later with faster steps. The camera angle could not catch a face. Only the cap brim and the arm load, which looked like quilt batting or a heavy sleeping bag. She thought about the soup, the hygiene packs, and the coats, then thought about the drag mark that ended near the rack. The rack had a hidden caster that always swiveled wrong, which left that same half-moon scrape when pushed sideways. She crouched and touched the caster, finding a smear of silt that did not match dust from raised corners. The twist snapped into view when she turned the soup case and saw a tiny sticker tucked behind the manufacturer's label, handwritten in blue ink. The sticker said Tuesday return hold with initials that were not Lyle's, which matched a habit from a former volunteer named Mateo. He left months ago after a family problem, but he signed returns with looping letters that everyone teased. Mateo's sister had asked for help in winter, and someone recalled she lived near the river park in a tent for a month. Witness statements from that season mentioned a man with a limp who avoided the main entrance because of pride. The archived calls showed a message from a restricted number on Monday evening, which said, "Ramp door buzzer broken, will circle back at dusk." Nora realized the inventory miscount for soup matched exactly the number of coats purchased at the thrift store on Sunday. 8 missing cans, 9 coats reported, and 3 toothbrush packs absent from the hygiene bin. She checked the program binder that tracked special requests, which listed a short note from 2 weeks ago about a family living in a truck with limited storage. Soup was labeled easy to heat, coats were labeled heavy but foldable, and toothbrushes were labeled priority for school-age kids. She looked at the ramp door again and saw a second set of scrapes, higher up, where a crutch might have knocked paint from the frame. She remembered Mateo broke his ankle years back, and the limp never fully left. Pete cleared his throat and said, "You think this is not a break-in, right?" Nora kept her voice steady, then said, "It looks like someone who knew the layout, who made sure the alarm stayed quiet, and who avoided asking directly because of shame." He rubbed his jaw, then nodded slowly as he watched her take a photo of the scraped paint. They called the non-emergency line again, and she read her notes while the dispatcher typed. The dispatcher said an officer could make an informational visit tomorrow and advised them to secure the door and replace the tie. She logged the reference number, stapled the list of missing items to the daysheet, then wrote a clear statement about suspected entry without damage for records only. She left a message for the pantry coordinator, age 51, paraeducator, explaining the situation with careful words about the storm and the power hiccup. She suggested moving the coat rack upstairs during inventory days and adding a second sign-off when labels were handwritten. She also suggested leaving a clear path for people who struggled with stairs, which sounded like a tiny policy shift hidden inside a counting problem. An hour later, a choir member named Lorna stopped by for her binder, and Nora asked if she had seen anyone at the ramp on Monday. Lorna said a man waited near the dumpster just before the thunder started again, holding a bag and looking anxious. She brought him into the vestibule briefly, offered water, and pointed him toward the office for assistance, but he left before she finished tuning the piano. Nora thanked her, logged the time, then matched it with the shadow on the final footage that crossed the landing at dusk. The puzzle fit without heroics, and the proof sat in quiet things like stickers and scratches and silt. The pantry had not been ransacked, only visited by someone who treated the space like an old workplace where he still belonged a little. She printed a fresh sign for the ramp that said "Ring bell twice for assistance," then taped it high where bus riders would see it. She taped another sign next to the loading latch that reminded volunteers to check the exit alarm light before locking. Pete found a spare battery for the alarm in a drawer and switched it while whistling a few off-key notes. Before leaving, she took one last slow walk with the clipboard, checking counts, finding that the numbers now made a practical sort of sense. The soup miscount lined up with the return sticker, the drag mark matched the broken caster, and the exit alarm explained the quiet door. The proof of entry was not dramatic, yet it was enough to tell a story that accounted for every small change. The next afternoon, the coordinator called back after speaking with a patrol officer who agreed to mark the report as information only. The officer reportedly checked dispatch logs from the storm night and confirmed multiple power blips across the block, which could explain the camera outage without conspiracy. The coordinator also reached Mateo through a community contact, who acknowledged taking coats and supplies, then offered to meet with her to return the soup or sign for it officially. Nora sat at the folding table and wrote a short summary for the pantry records, keeping it plain and careful and believable. She described the season's pressure, the storm, the small mistakes, and the way people try to preserve dignity when they are worn thin. She ended with a simple line about counting what matters and leaving a light where it can be found. She locked the loading door with a fresh tie, turned the thermostat back to normal, and unplugged the stubborn fridge for a counted 10 before restarting. The compressor settled into a softer hum that made the space feel less anxious, and the fluorescent lights kept their flicker but seemed less harsh than earlier. She put the clipboard away, then washed the silt from her hands until the water ran clear. On her way up the steps, she looked back at the neat rows of cans and the rack of coats that hung like quiet witnesses. The basement did not feel like a crime scene. It felt like a place that absorbed hard weather and kept doing its small work. The inventory told the story the way ledgers often do, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and specific enough to be true. Pete waited by the door and asked if she still wanted to find that lamp after her shift, and she smiled and said yes. He held the door as they stepped into the thin sunshine that follows a week of rain, where water still shone in shallow puddles. She made a mental note to buy a pack of batteries and write bigger labels, then walked toward the sidewalk with an easier stride. Later that week, the coordinator posted a message thanking the volunteers for patience and reminding everyone to sign twice when handwriting labels. The note also said the ramp bell worked again and that the basement alarm had a new battery with a date written in marker. A final line invited anyone needing help to knock during open hours and to leave a note if mobility made the stairs hard. Nora kept the broken zip tie in a drawer with a handful of odd things that never quite fit anywhere. She wrote the date on a card and tucked it with the tie as a simple reminder that proof can be small and stubborn. The basement went back to smelling like cardboard instead of worry, and the flicker of the lights felt ordinary again. She told her sister about the lamp and then about the inventory, and they both laughed quietly at how much a can of soup can reveal. The town kept moving around them in a slow, practical rhythm that ignored weather until it had to pay attention. The story rested inside a file folder without drama, but with enough careful detail to be respectfully believed.